This podcast was recorded on the ancestral lands on Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and the Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation.
This is Humans on Rights, a podcast advocating for the education of human rights. Here's your host, Stuart Murray.
Pride. Pride protest, Pride Day, Pride Week, Pride Parade, Pride Season. Born in protest, the Pride Festival has become a beacon of celebration and a lot more. And today on this podcast, I am joined by someone who is going to talk about their experience in Pride, specifically from the Royal Canadian Air Force, because my guest today is Major Jackie Zakhar. Jackie, welcome to Humans on Rights.
Right, thank you. Happy to be here.
So here's a little bit of a nutshell about who Major Jackie Zakhar is. She enrolled in the Royal Canadian Air Force in 2009 as an aerospace control officer. Major Zakhar was posted to 4-Wing in Cold Lake in 2012 following her instrument flight rules control training. And after an extended posting at 4-Wing, Major Zakhar was posted here in Winnipeg, 1 Canadian Air Division, as the executive assistant to the deputy commander. In 2022, Jackie was posted within 1 Canadian Air Division to the Combined Air Operations Center as a senior operations duty officer. And in 2023, Major Zakhar made an occupational transfer to the newly formed Air Operations Officer, Trade, and was posted to Barker College as the Department of Air Operations Chair and Program Director for the Ab Initio course. Major Zakhar is passionate about promoting diversity, equity, and inclusiveness and developing herself as a leader within the Royal Canadian Air Force. And in her free time, Major Zakhar enjoys adventures with her wife, who is an Air Maintenance Superintendent Master Warrant Officer, and their 2 young sons, as well as playing hockey, circuiting, and telling punny jokes. Jackie, welcome again to Humans on Rights. I'm going to put you on the spot right now. Tell us a punny joke.
Oh man, there's so many of them. So where I get my silly jokes from is I have a dad joke calendar, which is not super inclusive, but I do like the punny jokes. Of course, now I'm drawing a blank on all of them, but yeah, give me a minute and I'll come up with something. I'll think of something.
Yeah, no. I love them, to some extent, where normally you sort of read them and you go, okay, actually, that's just kind of clever. It's kind of interesting. So anyway, we'll get back to that. Just a reminder, that's how we're going to end the podcast. I'll ask you to tell one punny joke to start the podcast. So Jackie, you joined the Royal Canadian Air Force in 2009. So prior to that, tell us a little bit about who Jackie Zakhar was before the word major became a part of who Jackie Zakhar was.
Yeah, so quite honestly, I was a little bit lost in life. I was working full-time at Subway. I graduated from university. I went to the University of Western Ontario in London, Ontario, and I didn't really know what I wanted to do with my life. I had always kind of had the thought of wanting to join the military, but my mom was not overly supportive because I'm an only child, and her only thought was that I was going to go off to war and die. So I didn't join right away, but I was working at Subway and I was just like, I'm going nowhere. And I just made the jump to join the forces.
So at that time, were you born in London, Ontario, Jackie? Is that?
No, I wasn't. I was born and raised in Walkerton, Ontario, which is a couple of hours from London.
Yeah. Okay. And then you went to school in that community, but eventually university in London?
That's correct. Yeah.
Right. Okay. And so what was the draw for you to join the Royal Canadian Air Force?
So it was something that had always been in my mind, and I don't know what put it in my mind. My dad did serve in the Navy way back in the 70s, just for 3 years. And I don't know if that's what started it, or I just was always wanting to be part of something bigger. I did grow up in a small town where growing up gay was not a fun time. So the idea of getting away and sort of finding my own people, my own family was sort of probably one of the biggest draws. But I just, a lot of people will say you've answered the call to serve. So as sort of cliche as that sound, that's pretty much it. I just felt the call and wanted to be part of something big.
And so, Jackie, just as you mentioned it, and we talked a little bit about this, just before we hit the record button, about the reference to the queer community and how we would use that as a reference that would be all inclusive. So just to come back for a moment, I mean, Did any of your friends, did you talk to some of your friends knowing that you were part of the queer community, wanting to go into the Royal Canadian Air Force or just say the military in general, who doesn't have a long track record of being super open and inclusive for the community? How did you feel about that?
That truthfully didn't really come up. It was something that was in the back of my mind a little bit, but because I knew that, down in the US, they still had the don't ask, don't tell, and it was, illegal and all that stuff. But I knew that in the Canadian military, that had been taken away and that rights had gone back to, it's the same as a heterosexual couple would have. So that wasn't really a concern for me. I knew I was joining a male dominated industry anyways. And just who I am, I just tend to be very open and willing to help other people learn, provided that people come at me in, the right way. So I wasn't overly concerned about that. I'm pretty tough and figured I could stand up for myself. So some of my queer friends did question me on it a little bit, but mostly were just supportive of my sort of chosen path in life.
And is it fair to say that when you did join the Royal Canadian Air Force in 2009, Jackie, did you have any initial, issues at all that you might have looked at it and said, I know that there's laws that have been passed in Canada to talk about how we need to be treated all as equals. I'm not necessarily feeling that. Or would you say, what, I was very surprised. I mean, look, and I want to be very clear here. I'm not trying to pick on the CAF for a moment. This could be General Motors. It could be Bank of Montreal. I mean, it's an organization, right, of people. But I do think you're right when you say at the outset, Jackie, that this organization is fairly heavily male dominated and has been for years and years. Did you ever get a sense that it was going to be something more than perhaps you thought about? And I understand that you're, from a character standpoint, you're obviously very committed, very, I want to say tough. I mean, in a very positive way, clearly. But did you ever feel that this was going to be something that might sort of be a part of what you might have to deal with on a daily basis?
I wasn't so much from the sort of queer community standpoint. I was more concerned just as a woman in general. You hear about the negative things that happen. But for me, and it was something the way I was brought up, that you don't put yourself in situations where it could be unsafe. So I even now still approach, if I'm say approaching a new group of people, I will say my partner or my spouse versus my wife. And that's just something that I've always done. And then once I sort of get the feel for the crowd, especially if it's an older crowd, because we have different generations, just to sort of test the waters. Because if it's going to put me in an uncomfortable position or potentially them, I would rather just stick with my spouse than become my wife type thing.
Right. Yeah. I mean, just to tell you, Jackie, I did a podcast with a fabulous woman, Kate Sinclair. She's an adult filmmaker. And we talked to sort of about the human rights of people working in that industry. But just to make the point, I always said to her, I'm sure if you're having a conversation with somebody and they ask you, what do you do? And she would say, I'm a filmmaker. It'd be like, wow, that sounds interesting, blah, 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 blah. Versus, what do you do? I'm an adult filmmaker. It's like, oh, okay, where do I go with this? Right. So I respect how you would do that. Do you still feel that today in 2024, Jackie?
Yeah, 100%. Even just so, for example, where I'm at work with Barker College, so we run the Air Ops Officer course, and it's for new people coming into the trade. We just finished up a course, but the course was 15 weeks long. And when I first introduced myself to the students, I will say my spouse, my partner, whatever. And then once I sort of get a feel for the students and the composition, that's when I will then at some point just randomly switch to my wife or something like that. So I still very much do that to this day. Maybe not as much as I used to, just because I'm finding things are a lot better, but you just never know. So if it's a large group, I don't know them, I typically will still start with, my spouse.
Yeah. And just in your bio, we just love to touch on the fact that you've got two children. Tell us about your two children.
Yeah, I've got two little boys. They're 9 and 7. And I've been pleasantly surprised with their experiences so far in life because, of course, sending your boys to school, knowing they have two moms and knowing how kids are, you worry about what's going to be said to them and things like that. And we've been very lucky that thus far, we haven't had any issues with their school friends. They don't seem to care. The teachers have been fine. We haven't had any issues. When it comes to Father's Day, it's, sometimes the teachers will ask, okay, well, how do we deal with Father's Day with your family? And, we'll say, oh, we'll just get them to make something for Papa or whatever. So, yeah, we've got great boys. My oldest just turned 9 and my youngest will be 7 this week, actually. But when we had the boys, obviously we couldn't make them together. So there were a lot of questions, and it was actually really funny because I found a lot of the guys were very interested in how this happened, but they were very awkward about how they asked about it because they wanted to know, but they didn't, I guess, know the proper way to ask or if they were being rude or whatever. So it was quite comical at the time of, oh, well, how did that happen?
Yeah. And so just not to be awkward at all, but if you don't mind, and maybe it's a bit too personal, but did you adopt or how did you find your family?
So we went to a fertility clinic. I carried both our boys. So we just did IUI, which is not quite IVF. So my own eggs, and then we just got a donor and they do their thing and along come the kids.
Fantastic. And 7 and 9, 7 birthday this week and then 9?
Almost 7 yet. And 9 yet.
Yeah. And are they in the same school?
They are, yep. They're in the same school, same French immersion school, yeah.
Right. Yeah. Super amazing. Thanks for sharing that, Jackie. It's a wonderful thing. So, Jackie, let's talk a little bit about your experience, how you've seen growth within sort of the queer community within the CAF, and some of the things. Obviously, I think we want to talk about some of the celebrations because there are so many positive things, and as an honorary colonel who is blessed to sort of have the ability to witness some of these things from my perspective. I mean, I know 17 Wing has done some amazing things like the Diversity Garden. And, I have to give a shout out to my, I don't know how I refer to my previous colonel, but Dave Proto, who was the colonel for 17 Wing. He invited me to a lot of these meetings, so some of that happened. But from your perspective, Jackie, just, maybe talk about maybe some of the firsts when you were in the Royal Canadian Force, some of the firsts that you saw, some of the barriers that started to come down, and just share some of your personal experience, please.
Yeah, absolutely. And before we continue, I just want, because I know that some people do find the word queer to be a bit derogatory, but for me, it is something that, because we often, when you're trying to spit out the 2SLGBTQIA plus community, sometimes we find people are like, oh, the alphabet soup or whatever. So queer is a word that the community has tried to take back. So in this case, using queer, obviously we're not using it derogatory, but I know some people are uncomfortable with the word. So I just wanted to mention that.
Appreciate that clarification. Thanks.
But when I joined in 2009, so I would say I've been pretty lucky in my life in general, but also in my career. I mean, of course, there's been challenges. I believe the first pride flag. So when I joined in '09, there had not yet been a pride flag flown at any CAF bases. The first one was flown, I believe, in 2013 in Edmonton at the Army base. So it was flown there. And since then, it's just sort of steamrolled. And now, as you mentioned, the Diversity Garden here in Winnipeg. And one of the things that the CAF has done is they've made diversity advisory groups, or DAGs, because we love our acronyms. And within those groups, one of the groups is the DTPAO, which is the Defense Team Pride Advisory Organization. So I believe we're at 5 years now. It used to be the Defense Team Pride Network, and then they changed the name. But I believe this year is the 5th year for that organization. And having the DAGs has allowed those smaller communities, whether it be the women's community, persons with disability, the Indigenous community, has really allowed them a voice. So that's been a big change, definitely in the recent years. But when I first joined, it was typical of sort of anywhere else in society where you would hear gay jokes, same as you would hear blonde jokes. You would hear people saying things like, that's so gay, or what does your husband do? Or, you just really need to find the right man. So comments like that where people often didn't really think what they were saying. And I don't think necessarily meant them in a hateful way, but just sort of off the cuff, how we would make jokes, like a typical blonde joke or something like that. And I think I've been lucky in the sense that I think for the lesbian community, it's a lot easier than the gay community, and especially the trans community. They are still very much in their fight for equality. But I've been very lucky. And like I said, it's a lot of those sort of microaggression type things where people ask about your husband, and then you have that awkward moment where it's, oh, well, my wife, and making that. So that's something that still happens today, but I would say it's happening less and less. I couldn't tell you the last time I heard a gay joke at work. It's been probably years, which is fantastic. Whereas when I first joined, it was constantly gay jokes, constantly, oh, that's so gay, that kind of stuff. But you don't hear it anymore. And I think that's fantastic.
Yeah. And Jackie, do you put that down to like a level of education that's happened internally, or what do you think has caused that sort of that understanding and that education, which has been most important, to take place?
Yeah. So I think it's been a little bit of internal to the Canadian Armed Forces, but also just in general society. As people start talking about things more, same as I could equate it to mental health. You never used to talk about mental health. Nobody talked about their mental health. It was not even a thing. And now it's very much a thing. Everybody's talking about having, good mental health and things like that. So as you get educated about that, you realize how important that is. And I think the same thing has happened with the queer community that you have those sort of pioneers that stand up and say, hey, this isn't okay. We need to educate people on this. The CAF has done a lot of different things to try to educate folks. Some of them have worked, some of them haven't, some are better than others, but that's with anything. One of the things that they most recently did was remove the gender from our dress regs. So it was a big news story at the time because they also allowed multiple earrings, long beards, crazy colored hair, that kind of stuff. But the big underlying piece beyond all that, sort of big stuff was that gender was removed from the regs. So it was never, men will have this hairstyle and women will have this hairstyle. It was just hairstyles. So that's something that's a really big positive thing that if you're, cisgendered and probably male, you probably don't think about that. But if you're a woman or you're transgendered or you're non-binary or something like that, that is a big thing to have the gender removed from the dress regs. Because you can just, with one group, you just wear whatever is within the rules. It doesn't matter what your gender is.
You just fit in. And Jackie, would that have had a same impact, say, on, the fatigues, the different things that you wear, for whether it's cat pad or, whatever day it may require for what you're wearing? Is that the same sort of thing?
Yeah, pretty much. So within this CAD PAT uniform, not so much of a change because we all wear this anyways. There is only just one unisex style, but it would become more in when we wear our dress uniforms, our DEUs, because there were women's cuts and men's cuts. So there still are women's and men's cuts, but it's not now that I can only get the women's cuts. I have access to all of the things. And if someone who is outwardly presenting male wanted to wear a skirt, they're fully able to do so. Gender's been completely taken out. So that was definitely a big change. And also then with the hair regs, because of course, obviously men always had to have, the very short hair, short on the sides, whereas now it's one hairstyle. So you can have whatever, whether you're male, female, or non-binary, whatever hairstyle you want, essentially, within the regulations, of course, but it's not men will have this one and women will have this one. So that's probably the biggest change was the hairstyle so that, those that weren't female could then have long hair.
For sure. And Jackie, again, not sure if you're able to sort of answer this question because it's, just comes down to, sort of kind of how did it happen? And what I mean by that is that, when these changes take place in organizations, real good organizations will go to their front lines and they'll talk to people and they'll find out maybe why enrollment isn't there. Maybe there's organizations that say we need more customers, whatever it may be. But sometimes, it takes people going to the grassroots of the organization to talk about how do we adapt? How do we pivot? Did that take place? And can you speak to maybe any involvement you might have had with that?
Yeah, 100%. So, I mean, obviously it's the people at the top that make the final decisions, but the CAP does do a relatively decent job to usually comes out in surveys and things like that, or what we call town halls when you'll have some high ranking person stand in front of a group of people and ask questions or have them ask you questions, that type of thing. But they do start to ask questions like that. So we also have something called CPCC, which is the Chief Professional Conduct and Culture Group. So they were heavily involved, as far as I know, in the new dress regs. But they also have a dress committee. And within that dress committee, they did include the DAG, so the Defense Advisory Groups. So I was there for one of the first meetings when they were discussing about some of the changes coming up, even from baseball caps and things like that, because there had to be that gender piece with the baseball caps because we couldn't get the fitted ones because if women are, because at that time it was still, the dress regs were still separated. If you had a bun, you obviously couldn't wear a baseball cap that was fitted because you need a hole in the back. So they did include the women's group, they included the Indigenous group, they included, as far as I know, all of the DAGs to be part of these discussions of what is important to the people on the ground or in the trenches, as we like to say, because we're the ones that are going to be around. So what is important? And the thing too with the dress regs is that, and something that the CAF is maybe not great at, is staying with the times. So as society changes, the CAF is supposed to be representative of Canadian society. So we thus, as society changes, we also need to change and adapt and grow. So the dress regs was sort of that first big thing that we did do to go to society, understanding that people with piercings and tattoos and things like that are still fully professional working people. But yeah, they definitely include at the grassroots level. And I'd say a lot of the stuff does come from the grassroots level. One of our initiatives, actually, and I made sure I had it on me here, is the DTPAO has their patch. So this is for the Defense Team Pride Advisory Organization. It was actually the Winnipeg DTPAO that it was our initiative to do this. And we did face some struggles in getting this. There was some resistance, more from the policy standpoint, because a lot of our policies need to be updated, but things take time and they need to be worded properly, and they've got various levels of review. So we did have some trouble getting this because it didn't fall within the policy. But once the right people got a hold of it, we got approval pretty quick across the RCAF. So not just in Winnipeg, which is what we originally were going for. We just wanted to be able to wear it around the wing when we went to Pride, that kind of stuff. But we actually managed to get it approved for all of the RCAF. And I believe CAF approval is probably in the works, but I don't know where that's at.
Yeah. So Jackie, let me just sort of stop for a second there. I mean, because what you're holding up is a patch that really is a pride patch, and it represents the DTPAO, which is the Defense Team Pride Advisory Organization. But, one of the things that I've learned as an honorary colonel, and I've learned so much when I get a chance to spend time at 17 Wing, is that in business, people always talk about their CV, and they've got a piece of paper and they hand you the resume and here's who I am, et cetera. And it's a document. Whereas in the military, your CV is kind of, you wear it. It's on your body. And so people can tell if you're a lieutenant or a colonel, a sergeant, or whatever it may be. So the patch that you're referring to, Jackie, is that something that would be voluntary to wear, or could you wear it on the basis that you're saying we support, so you become an ally, or is it mandatory? Or can you just talk a little bit about how would that patch impact the uniform?
Yeah, 100%. So no, it's absolutely voluntary. And this was actually a discussion that came up when we were in the process of having the patch approved. There was some concern that having that patch on your shoulder, that would show that maybe you are queer or whatever, and that might then open you to harassment or potential violence or whatever, which when we were going through it, didn't even cross my mind, because in my mind, putting that on you says I'm a safe space. Doesn't necessarily mean that I'm part of the community. Could mean that I'm an ally or I'm just supportive or, whatever. But what we were going for was, the visibility of saying, hey, that person's got pride colors on their shoulder. What's that from? What's the DTPAO? Because one of the biggest things is that visibility piece of saying, hey, we're here. Hey, we're a safe space. Because there are lots of people who come up and maybe they haven't been as fortunate as I have been, where I am very open about who I am because I feel confident about it. I feel comfortable for the most part. But some people may not have that, especially if you have, a transgender person. That is, still very much a community that still needs a lot of love and support. So to have, if I have that on my shoulder and maybe I don't right away scream, oh, here comes a gay person, but that patch can then show that, hey, this person is at least supportive in some way. I need to talk to them. And then that's how we can get more people into the DTPAO and, learning and spreading the word. And it's really that visibility piece. But yeah, absolutely voluntary. Originally, we said you had to be part of the DTPAO, but then we were like, no, if people want to buy these patches, anybody can wear it. So it's just that sort of visibility piece of, hey, that might be someone I can talk to.
Yeah. And, what's fascinating about it, Jackie, is just that, some of the links which you provided for background reading, which I will put into the episode notes of this podcast, is I think it's really interesting to go in and learn about, here we are in 2024, more work to be done, obviously, but talking about being able to wear a patch that might signal to somebody, hey, this is a safe space. Whereas you go back not that long ago, Jackie, I mean, certainly, prior to before you joined in 2009, but not long before that, I mean, there were organizations that people were searching out anybody who was part of that queer community, specifically to discriminate, to get them out, to remove them. You make reference to the fruit machine, which, I mean, it's astonishing. It's like science fiction, but at that time, those elements were so real that, I mean, even I think I read somewhere in that wonderful Voxer article that your friend wrote that even though, you started to celebrate the Pride Parade, in the early stages, people from the queer community would still wear maybe a bag on their face just so they wouldn't be recognized. And, thank goodness we've come further where we're now celebrating as opposed to, it's not an element of protest, it's an elevation of celebration. So, you look at how far we've come. I guess the question always becomes, Jackie, how much more do we have to do? I mean, because society evolves. And when you look at the fact that, there's areas, particularly the trans community, who are, these things come in waves and stages. And I think the gay community has, done, suffered tremendously, but has come forward, and sort of the lesbian community and sort of that two-spirited community, et cetera. But, the trans community is one that continues to struggle. And how do we continue to advance those conversations positively in our everyday conversation when there's, I think, a group, and I'll just say a group, that are finding that they are concerned that books about trans children are in our libraries, or books about, they're deciding that maybe they shouldn't be so available to kids. And I think that one of the things that, I've had conversations with, but I certainly don't want to pretend for a second, Jackie, that I understand it. I haven't had to go through it, but to understand what it's like to become a trans person and look for support. And how do we do that? And how does that happen? And I don't know if you have any thoughts you want to share on that, because, that is another part of the community that, as you say, deserves love and support like everybody else.
Yeah, definitely. As far as the books in school, so I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with Pride Month and all things Pride, because it is a time of love, a time of celebration, and just, a lot of community. But there's also, if you go on Facebook or any media thing where it's some sort of positive post towards Pride, if you go into the comments, there'll be just as many negative comments, if not more, than positive comments. So, people say, well, why do we still need a Pride? You have equal rights. Well, read any of the comments on any positive Pride post, and that'll tell you exactly why we still need these things to happen. But there's a lot of misconceptions, I think, especially with the trans community, because there will be the few that will ruin it for the many. So the problem, I think, is that we still have this misconception that you have men who are pretending to be women going into the change room to, spy on little boys or little girls or whatever, where most people just want to go and use the bathroom and get out of there type thing, right? But there's still that misconception. And, you often read about, the queer community grooming children, and we can't have these books because you're grooming these children. But it's not that at all, obviously. And it's just putting that awareness out there, because if you have a young person who can't figure out why they don't feel like they're friends, or they're not interested in the boys they're supposed to be interested in, or a little girl doesn't want to wear dresses and they're confused, there's a reason that the suicide rate is so high in the trans community, because it's such a confusing time. And it's, some people still feel that they're better off to be dead than to come out as trans, which is heartbreaking. And what can you do? The only thing you can do is, if you have someone that who's come out, or, a child or something that says that they're trans, is support them. Even if you don't understand, you don't know the inclusive language to use, you mess up the pronouns, as you had mentioned earlier, someone tells you their pronouns are they, them, but you accidentally say she or he, it's trying to be better. It's trying to do your best. I've often said to my peers in the community, if someone comes to you and they ask a question about being trans or being gay or whatever, and they're coming from a place of wanting to learn, even if they ask it wrong, or they ask it maybe even offensively, if they don't mean it that way, but they're trying to learn, answer them. Now, if they're obviously coming at you in a derogatory manner, okay, fine. No. So the only thing you can really do is try to be there for that person. Ask them what they need. How can you help? Because it's so different for everybody. And just, checking up on your friends and the people that that are in the community, because people can look fine on the outside and not be on the inside. It's just speaking up too. If, say someone at your work were to come out that they're trans and they're going to switch to their gender that they feel that they are. And if you hear other people making comments, oh, well, you see Joe is now Josephine, and oh, look, then they're making comments, is stop those comments. Speak out, say, hey, we don't need to talk about this. We don't need to talk like this. and sort of being that bystander. It's one of the words we use in the military is if you're a bystander and you see something happening, whether it be towards women or people of color or the LGBT community, say something. Don't just let it happen and not do anything. Say something, because some people don't even realize the things that they're saying or doing are offensive. So you can bring that up and say, hey, that was not really a good way to phrase that. They may not even realize. So
Yeah, and I think, great advice for sure, Jackie. I think that, there's lots of very public examples of people who, just use the expression doth protest too much about somebody who might be gay or trans or whatever, and only to find out that, they themselves are harboring, their own issues, but they find a way to lash out. And maybe, as you say, they're trying to deal with it. Lots of examples in the States about, famous US senators who are opposed to same-sex rights, only to find out that they're on the side doing different things. And what does that mean? So why be so adamant about it, but maybe be quiet, maybe be supportive. So yeah, I think that's amazing. And I think, the fact that you've been so kind of open on these conversations, I think it's really, really helpful. And I guess the piece that I'd be interested in, Jackie, is, do you think that because the CAF, the Canadian Air Force, has become so more open with the DAG, the Diversity Action Group, that you've seen more enrollment from, and again, just because we're using the word queer community in a positive way, would you say that you have seen maybe more members of the queer community come into the CAF because they've been open?
I'm sure it hasn't hurt. I can't say for sure that people are joining knowing that the CAF is trying. There are certainly still a lot of issues within the CAF, but I mean, there is anywhere in society, really. But I think people also, especially the new generation coming in, they want to make changes. They want that equality. That old saying of, do as I say, not as I do, and, just shut up and do it. The generation coming in now, they don't stand for that. They want to know why, and they question things, and they want things to be better. And if even if someone has a speech where they say, ladies and gentlemen, chances are afterwards, somebody's probably going to come up to them and say, hey, that was not inclusive. Distinguished guests, you don't have to say ladies and gentlemen. So I think it's probably a combination of, yes, people know that the forces is trying, but I think people they just want to be part of something bigger, and being part of a military family, or the military is like a big family. And I think that brings people in just in general as well.
Yeah. And I think, again, just as you're mentioning, the difference between ladies and gentlemen, which is just such a standard thing. But as you say, I mean, it's not standard in 2024. It wasn't standard probably 30 years ago, but people used it. So that's a great way, Jackie, just to sort of look at, a way of just a welcoming distinguished guests and kind of being as inclusive as you possibly can. I guess the one thing is that if you were to, if somebody listening to this and saying, wow, how would, if I had a chance to ask Jackie this question and I wanted to sort of be, and I don't know, how do you feel about the word ally in the terms of somebody who wants to support somebody in a different community? How do you feel about that term?
So the thing about being an ally is it's not an in the moment thing. So I have an issue with people who say they're an ally. Maybe they show up at Pride, but the rest of the year they aren't really doing anything. So if you want to truly be an ally, you're an ally all the time. And an ally can be, I mean, you can be an ally and not attend Pride or anything like that. But you can be an ally as small as, saying something like, hey, don't say, hey guys, say, hey folks, hey peeps, more inclusive, that, getting rid of that, ladies and gentlemen. You can be an ally in something as similar as that. You can be, or sorry, something as simple as that. You can be an ally. For example, my last boss, when I worked in the operations center, he was the stereotypical manly man, hunts, makes his own meat, does all of the things are typical, stereotypical manly man. And he was a huge ally in the community. Straight as an arrow, but he would be the first one to speak up and say something. He would come to events and he would share his story, because his father was one of the people during the purge back in the 90s, early 90s and the 80s and stuff, when they were seeking out members of the queer community. His father was an MP at the time, and he was part of those people who were searching out the other people. So he has some internal turmoil because of that. So his way to, I guess, maybe make up for it, or correct some of the wrongs that his father had done, he's been a strong supporter of the queer community. And just being there, marching in the parade with us, that kind of stuff, that is how you can be an ally. But like I said, it's not just a 1 minute thing. It's an all the time thing.
Yeah. And I think, language, Jackie, as we know today is so, you have to be very careful with language because, to sort of pump your chest and say I'm an ally, it's like, if you have to say it, maybe you're not. Like, just it's more through demonstration and how you can kind of make that work. Jackie, just in your conversation, you did mention the word purge. And of course, one of the things that is happening very much today is there is an exhibit that is being developed and will be, I think, unveiled at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, which is all about the LGBTQ purge. Just before I ask you a little bit about that, because I went on some of the stuff that you sent me, which was so fascinating to read, but I realized that some of the people that are on the LGBTQ purge board were former members of the Royal Canadian Air Force. And so it's interesting to see that tie. But one of the things that I would ask is that the LGBTQ purge, in the actual name, it does not mention two-spirited. It does not mention one plus. It does not mention some of the other elements. Is that something that needs to be addressed or changed? Or again, I want to ask this, be very clear, Jackie. I know you have nothing to do with that, but I'm just sort of from your perspective, again, just from a learning perspective, because it does seem that there's an option, or somebody might say it's not as inclusive as it could be.
I have thought about that actually, why it is only the LGBT purge. And my suspicion would probably be that when, that ban was lifted, I think in 92, when the class action lawsuit and all that stuff came out, the acronym at the time probably was still just the LGBT. Whereas as we've learned more, even in recent years, the 2S piece was at the end and they've moved it to the beginning to recognize that two-spirited individuals were here before the rest of us. So as we learn more, we adapt and change. And sometimes it does become confusing of what is the acronym now. But for the purge itself, I suspect, like I said, it's probably because at that time it was just the LGBT was sort of the acronym. And I would guess that probably for licensing reasons, they haven't changed it. Could they change it? Absolutely, because there would have absolutely have been two-spirited people, intersex people, more of the further on letters that would have been part of the purge. So if they wanted to be more inclusive, they could definitely change the acronym. But of course, I can't speak to why they haven't.
No, and I mean it very well. I mean this is all organic, and these things happen. I mean, I think even if I have to go back and listen to myself here, but I think instead of saying LGBT, I think I said LGBTQ. So I've even misrepresented it in kind of the way that I presented it. So yeah, it's a fascinating journey, and again, there's so much information that you have so generously offered, kind of when you filled out the podcast info form, which I'll make sure are part of the episode notes, Jackie, because it's really, really informative and very easy to access. Is there anything that you would like to share with anybody listening that maybe I haven't asked you that you would think, look, there's something I really want to just sort of share with anybody who's listening about my experience, where we've gone, what we need to do, just anything from your perspective, Jackie, on this whole journey that you've been on?
From the queer side of it, I would say to folks who are maybe struggling or they're, the big thing about making progress is being persistent. So we often feel that as individuals, we can't make change. And I would 100% say that you as an individual can. So if there's something that a person is noticing that needs to be changed, speak up. From the other side of it, if you are looking to support someone or gather information, ask. Ask as politely as you can. Some people are not open, depending on what their experiences are not open to talking about things. I had mentioned before we started recording about how when my wife and I were having our children, there were a lot of people who were very interested in, well, how did that happen? But they were very awkward about asking it. And I would just say, ask me whatever you want to ask. And if I'm not comfortable, I won't answer it, but ask me whatever you want to ask. Some people aren't open like that. And we also have to respect that. So if you ask a person something, maybe you want to know about their experiences or their life, but they're not open to it, you do have to respect that as well. But some people will be very much open to it. If folks wanted to know more about things in the CAF specifically, there are links to the DTPAO, various email addresses that you can get in contact with folks if people want to know more within the forces. But ask. Don't be afraid of what you don't know. Ask questions. And those on the queer side, be open to answering those questions.
Yeah, great way to kind of hit the off-ramp in our conversation, Jackie. Thank you so much. I'm going to ask Major Jacqueline Zakhar for one honey joke.
I got one. All right. What do you call a fake noodle? An impasta. It's terrible.
And pasta. I love it. I love it, Jackie. Good for you. I love it. Well done. You know what? I mean, if people sort of start groaning and sort of that, you hit the nail on the head. That's fantastic. Jackie, thank you so much for this conversation. Thank you for sharing your personal journey, some of the things that you've experienced and, with your family and your kids. And, I wish you a wonderful summer. Again, I just want to acknowledge that you have your wife with you now with your kids, and you found some time in your family time to jump on to do this podcast. So please understand that I really appreciate your time and appreciate all that you've done. And thank you for sharing.
Sure. My pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Humans on Rights. A transcript of this episode is available by clicking the link in the show notes of this episode. Humans on Rights is recorded and hosted by Stuart Murray. Social media marketing by Buffy Davey. Music by Doug Edmond. For more, go to humanrightshub.ca.
Produced and distributed by the Sound Off Media Company.